Hello and happy Monday. I'm Nicole Summerall, developer advocate for partner engineering and developer relations, and today we're going to highlight the new features of Roku Resource Monitor 3.0. In just a few minutes, Chris Hagedorn, senior software engineer from our developer platform team, will review and then demo the new features in RRM 3.0. After Chris is done, we'll do a live Q&A session where Chris and Ram Kavarsari, Senior Manager for Developer Platform, will answer your questions, which you can submit through Slido. The Slido link for this webinar is go.roku.com/rrm-3-o-QA. You can also find the link to Slido in the webinar blog post and in the Zoom chat. Once you ask a question, your fellow attendees will upvote or downvote it, which will help determine whether it gets read on air. Please be aware that while we do not comment on our roadmap or make other forward-facing commitments during the Q&A session, we do welcome feature requests and other suggestions around what would help make RRM better. If you have to leave early or you want to share this video session, we will post a recording of it on the Roku Developers YouTube channel, Roku Developer Video Portal, and the Roku Developers channel. So without further ado, let's get started. Chris Hagedorn, everybody. Take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Nicole, and thank you all for joining us. Today, we're going to be looking at Roku Resource Monitor 3.0. This is the latest and greatest version of the tool as of spring 2024, and it's rolling out alongside Roku OS 13.0. So today, first I'll talk a little bit about the tool itself in general for people who may not be familiar with it. Then I'll talk a little bit about features that are new specifically in version 3.0, and then we'll spend most of our time actually using the tool and seeing what it can do. So Roku Resource Monitor is our visualization tool for system resources on a Roku device while running a BrightScript app. And it can help you visualize all kinds of things that your channel is doing, including system memory, graphics memory, CPU usage, scene graph nodes, frame rate, registry usage, and things like rendezvous and object allocation. Object allocation is new in version 3, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a second. Roku Resource Monitor also supports both live and file modes, which means that once you're done recording a session, you can export that data and then import it back into the tool later. Or what's even more useful a lot of times is you can take that data file and share it with someone else on your team, and they can load it into their copy of Roku Resource Monitor and see the same data that you saw, and which is really useful for debugging apps. So object allocation is the big new feature in Roku Resource Monitor 3. There are 3 new graphs in the tool, all related to object allocation. One, and we'll see these a bit more in action in a minute. One shows you total object allocation. One will break that object allocation out by the type of object that's being allocated. And then there's a third configurable graph that will only show you the specific types of objects that you might be interested in seeing. You can also configure, like all the other graphs in RRM, you can configure the polling frequency that object allocations are tracked at. And also new in RRM3 is the ability to synchronize all of the graphs, not just the object allocation graphs, but all of the graphs in the horizontal dimension, so that as you scroll any one graph, all the others can be made to scroll along with it. And so with that, let's jump in and actually play with the tool a little bit and see what it can do. So here we are in Roku Resource Monitor 3. And to anybody who's used the tool before, this is going to look pretty familiar. The first thing you see when you launch the tool is this dialog asking you to choose a device that you want to attach to. So I'm going to do that. And get to that button. Okay, and then once you're attached to a device, it's going to show you the side-loaded channel if there is one. And in this case, I've side-loaded a copy of Roku Media Player. So I'm going to select that. And now here we are in the main interface. And on the top, like I mentioned, you have the tab for live versus file mode. We're going to start in live mode and we'll explore file mode in a bit. On the left, this is your session controls. So I can start a session here. It tells me what device I'm attached to, what channel I'm going to be debugging. There's some device-specific information here, model, serial number, etc. Here is the polling interval we talked about. I'm actually going to change this to 5 seconds. And here is the synchronize all scroll bars feature that I mentioned is new in this version. So I'm going to actually turn that on and we'll see how it works. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and start a new session. And I'm going to launch that side-loaded version of Roku Media Player. And immediately you'll see the data start showing up on these graphs. So we're just going to go through the graphs real quick, top to bottom, for people who aren't familiar with the tool. This top graph is memory usage. Of particular interest here, to me at least, is this foreground and background limits. And this will vary depending on what type of device you're connected to. And that's a really good indicator of how your channel is doing in terms of what's allowed on that particular device. So it's really useful when you're testing on a low-end device. And that corresponds to these dotted lines at the top. You can also, as you see here, you can kind of hover over the lines and see in real time these numbers change. They're not changing now because the channel's not doing anything. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate into this media server and start playing some music. We'll just let that go. And there, as soon as I did that, you can see these numbers start to change. You can control which of these data points are displayed in the hover using this menu up here. You can come and I can turn off, say I want to turn off swap and resident. And then now you'll see when I hover, those are gone. The next graph, this is graphics memory. You see it's grayed out by default, but you can turn it on with one click right here on this little guy. And all the graphs have that. You can toggle them on and off. And you can see here, as soon as I toggle it on, data starts showing up. You can also collapse and expand all the graphs using this little caret button. So I can collapse that one, re-expand it. The next graph is CPU usage, which is doing what you would kind of expect it to be doing as I'm playing audio. Scene graph metrics, this is the number of scene graph nodes that your channel is using at any given point in time. And again, this kind of matches up with what we're doing in the channel. There's a spike when we started playing audio, and also probably from browsing that media server. We probably created quite a few content nodes when we were doing that. Here's frame rate. Similar, it's very low right now because the UX is only updating once a second or so when that progress bar changes. Registry usage, media player doesn't use any registry, so that's a 0. But if you were doing registry, you would see it here. Here's scene graph rendezvous. Again, there's a spike at launch. Here's a spike probably while I was browsing the media server, and then basically 0 as I'm playing audio, which is expected. Then we get to the new stuff, the memory allocation stuff in 3.0. And again, this first one grayed out by default, but I can turn it on. And it would show if there were data here, but it was disabled. If there were data here, it's just the overall total number of objects your channel is using. And I can launch the channel again, and you can see that. There you go. There's a bar. And it's just a total count, nothing more, 888. And then with this second graph, this is where it starts to get interesting. So these are the top 10 by default BrightScript objects in use by the app. And you can see the most commonly allocated is a string in this case. There's some other really interesting stuff that this graph is doing that we'll take a look at in a minute when we get into file mode. You can also change this to show only the top 5 or only the top 3 if you like. You can also change the style of this graph. You can have it be horizontal, or you can even have a line graph. I personally like the stacked bars like this. And then down here we have the customizable graph. Now I haven't customized it at all, so there's nothing here. But if I wanted to, I can come up here and say, I want to see only arrays and say maybe strings. And then those, I can come back down here. Let me move this out of the way. Okay, then I can come down here and say, those are the only 2 that are showing up in this graph now, are those 2 that I just enabled. And then you can also filter even farther here. You can turn individual ones on and off. Something else, so let me stop this. Let's stop this session. Let me exit the channel and then stop this session. And it's going to ask me if I want to download the data for the session. And in this case, I do, because I'm going to use it to demonstrate file mode in a second. So I'm going to say, yes, download this. Okay. And then I think we can get rid of this. We're done with it. Okay, so let's go over to file mode and load up that same file. It's going to warn me that I'm going to lose my live session. That's fine. I'm going to say upload a file, and I'm going to choose this guy, the file we just created. And here it is. This is all data from that exported file. Now I'm going to scroll. Well, first I'm going to show you the synchronizing all scroll bars thing. So here you see it kind of by default open to the end of the session. So I'm going to scroll backwards in time, and you'll see that as I do, all the graphs jump with it. So now everything should be back to the beginning. So some interesting things in some of these graphs. In the memory usage graph, you can see as it played, this guy ramped up, all the way until it hit this dotted line. And then it took a dive. And that's because the system shut the channel down. When you hit that dotted line, the OS is going to kill your app. And that's what it did here. And so that's a good indication that there might be a memory leak somewhere. And there is. I intentionally introduced a memory leak into that particular build of Media Player just to show you this among some other things. So let's go back down a little ways. Here again, you can see in the scene graph chart, we started playing video player, audio, playing audio, and then all of a sudden it goes to 0. That's where the OS shut it down. Let's look at object allocation count. So we saw in the top chart that there was pretty obviously a memory leak. But that doesn't help us much. We want to try and figure out where's that leak coming from. So the new object allocation count feature in RRM3 makes that a little bit easier. And so you can see by the time the channel got killed, there were 521 arrays, and that was the #1 most allocated thing in the channel. And as you kind of go back through time, you can see that number getting smaller and smaller until here you can see where it stops being the #1 allocated object and falls down to #2. And here it falls to #3, #4. So that's pretty obviously what's growing is arrays. And so that narrows down the possible causes of your memory leak. And from that point, you would probably want to go over and use a tool like the BrightScript profiler to dig even deeper and see where those arrays are being created. The profiler can take you down to an individual line of code. It'll take you from a thread to a function to a line of code. And that will help pinpoint that memory leak. But you can at least get a general idea of what might be going on using these new object allocation charts. And that's it. That's a quick look at Roku Resource Monitor 3.0. Back to you, Nicole.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Hopefully everybody found that video really useful. So at this time, we're going to open things up for Q&A. So we've got Ram and Chris and Kevin here with us. So if you'd like, you can go ahead and turn your video. And so we're going to be going through the questions that we've received during the webinar, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. So I'm just going to start at the top here. Can you explain how we can interpret and improve graphics rendering frame rate data shown in RRM, best practices, and what would an ideal graph look like for all device, CPU, and memory types?
I think there's kind of two questions there. So I can take the frame rate one, and it really depends what you're doing at the time. So like in the demo you saw, as the music was playing, the frame rate was pretty low, like 2 or 3 frames a second. That's a good thing because the channel is not updating its UI very often, so there's no need to be doing 60 frames a second at that point. But in a situation where, say, you have a grid of content that the user's browsing around, in that case, you actually want the frame rate to be as high as possible. So if I'm holding down a D-pad button, quickly scrolling through a graph, you do want 60 frames a second in that case. So it's kind of context dependent.
Okay, great. Okay, so next up from Justin Tucker, I have RRM up now. How can I find out which version I'm running?
Um, on the if you're running Mac, on the top bar, you can press Roku Resource Monitor and About. See a similar thing for all your other platforms, and it will have a pop-up that tells you the um, version. One caveat: if you've just launched RRM for the first time, there will be uh, a guide that is on top of that, so you have dismissed the initial guide to see the version behind it.
Okay, great.
Hopefully that helps.
I'm sure it does. Thank you so much. Okay, so the next question, system memory usage / anonymous memory. Roku Docs says, quote, developers can control the amount of anonymous memory used by their channel, end quote. Can you please explain how exactly developers can control it, and maybe some specific examples?
I'm not sure where in the docs it says that. That is kind of an awkward statement. I don't think it means that you can explicitly put a limit on your channel or anything. The system will do that like we saw in the demo, where if you hit the limit for that device, it will just kill you. But there are lots of different development strategies you can use to sort of minimize the amount of memory you're using. So um, when you're building your content nodes, don't stick unnecessary data on them. Like only stick to the metadata fields that are documented for content nodes. When you're done, like you get a big API response back from your server. When you're done parsing it, throw away that JSON structure and only keep the bits and pieces you need for the channel to actually do what it needs to do. So things like that.
Let me add on to that. If this is the first time you're using Roku Resource Monitor, when you see the memory graph, you will see a lot of lines on it. Um, the anonymous memory line is what you should focus on as what your app is actually allocating. That's the one that you have the most influence on. Just to give you the way I would use it, or I do use it, um, I look at the anonymous memory graph and see what the memory allocation is. Then I go down to the object allocation count, and just keep in mind that when the object allocation count grows up in the allocation graph, the anonymous memory may or may not tick up or down because the objects may be really, really small. But those are the two things that I correlate to say, hey, am I allocating a lot of stuff and is it actually making a big difference to what the system's using? Hopefully that helps you to understand what anonymous memory is or why that's important to your app. That's what you're allocating.
Okay, and then we've got a very similar and same vein question. System usage memory, file backed memory. Roku Docs says it's a BrightScript code, but what exactly does it mean? Just objects we create in our channel, like nodes, associative arrays, etc.?
I don't know. Kevin, do you know what that means?
Yeah, it's actually kind of the opposite of that. Your anonymous memory corresponds to RAM, where every time you create an object, it's consuming RAM. But for the file-backed memory, when it says BrightScript code, BrightScript is compiled into a bytecode representation, and that is read-only data. And the Roku OS system actually stores those in files that can be paged in and out of memory and reloaded from the files when necessary. So that's read-only data. That's different from RAM, where you're allocating your objects, which can't be discarded as a cache system. It has to be actually preserved in main memory.
Kevin, is it fair to say that the file back memory for the channel is a direct indication how big the source code is for the channel?
Yes, it's the amount of compiled code, but it's not something that you can influence other than having less code or more compact code for your channel.
Okay. And I will go back to the previous question and say this is why we look at anonymous memory when your channel is running, because that's what your channel actually allocates at runtime. There's other things that I was going to take the other question there. There was I think 4 down because it's related. The system memory usage, shared memory. All right. These are all various categories of memory. When you have media or other texture or whatever, I think those goes into shared memory. Kevin, if I've got that wrong, you can correct me on that. But that's how I've always interpreted shared memory.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the system is complex, and details are not may of the implementation may vary across OS releases. But I believe that the video shared memory is pre-reserved to a certain size, so decreasing stream's resolution won't actually impact that. I think it's just a fixed cost in the system, but I'm happy to have anyone else correct me.
I don't think anyone's going to correct you. Okay, so no, you
Marcelo
go
has
ahead.
Go ahead, Nicole. Next
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, I was going to read. Yeah, Marcelo has a question. It was at the top. This is a generic question about the dev tools. When you will make the app installers signed to prevent macOS and Windows to block installation and forcing users to override the OS security warnings.
For RRM, we already do this. For the other tools that we download, it is on our roadmap to do. So very high on our roadmap. We'll make sure that that is solved.
Okay. Next question at the top is from Manny. Is there any option for the object allocation to sort the graph by memory usage of the objects instead of counts? For example, arrays or nodes would take up more memory than strings, so it doesn't seem to make sense to sort on count.
Yeah, I can, take that quickly. Just, we're definitely aware that view would be useful as well. It's a little bit harder to present that in a way that users can see at a very high level what types of objects they might be leaking. As the counts make it pretty clear, if you're exercising some functional loop and you see the counts go up by a certain number every time, it makes it a little bit easier to track down. But it's definitely something we're keeping in mind for future views, to actually track the amount of bytes used by the different types of objects.
Yeah, and we welcome any other feedback on that too. We are constantly thinking about what data and the ways in which it's presented would be most valuable to all of you. So we'd love to hear from you.
Okay. All right, the next question. Is it possible to add custom beacons to show up in RRM graphs? Would it be useful in debugging memory leaks and investigating how much each feature uses resources?
It is not possible today, but this is a really good ask. We will take that away back to the team.
Yeah, you can see the standard. I think that's actually something I may have skipped over in the demo, but you can see sort of the app start beacons and your video start beacons that that will show up in those graphs.
Okay, next question. Will a smaller background memory footprint mean the app tends to stay in background longer?
That's a great question.
I think yes,
Yes.
probably.
It's also a function of how much memory pressure your device is seeing and whether the OS needs to um, terminate any apps in the background. All right. But generally, if you use less memory while you're in background, you're putting less pressure on the system, and you should tend to stay in memory longer.
Yeah, I think it might also take into account how long it's been since an app has been launched. So it won't necessarily always throw away the biggest app, but having a smaller footprint will definitely tend to keep you in memory longer.
Okay,
And
awesome.
the answer to the question from Manny, if your app had one array with 5 strings contained within it, yes, we will show one array and the 5 strings.
It's actually a little bit subtle on that because there are actually different types of strings. String constants actually get stored in some read-only data, and they don't actually show up in this this count, because no matter how many times you use a string constant, like if you say x equals quote double quote foo double quote and y equals double quote foo double quote, those are both string constants and they don't actually count against dynamic allocations. So in that case, you would see one array and you would not see the 2 strings. But if a string is composed through some calculation where it's appending strings together, in that case, those will be dynamically allocated strings and they will show. So just be aware that, you know, there are subtleties like that where you might not see strings being reported in the counts as allocations. It's actually a good thing, but it's confusing.
If you parsed a JSON array, JSON object, and that had an array in 5 strings, that would show up as 1 plus 5. If you put, as Kevin says, if you put those 5 strings in your source code as static strings, those 5 strings will not show up. So, thank you, Kevin, for bringing that up, because that did throw me for a loop for a while until we discussed that and figured that out too.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. All right, next question. The anonymous memory graph does not correlate with the node count graph. Note that graphs may behave similarly when adding nodes, but not always when removing or dereferencing nodes. How can we determine actual memory usage when this happens?
I think
Yeah,
you'd
I mean,
want
I
to
think
pay attention to the memory graph more. If you're looking for memory, look at the memory graph. Because remember, the memory, like in the demo, we saw that big ramp. I intentionally put a memory leak in there, and it didn't do any nodes at all. It was just creating arrays. And so in that case, the memory graph goes way up, but the node count would not have changed at all during that same period of time. Sorry, Kevin, you had something to add?
yeah, I think Justin's referring to a bug that he had filed where there is some pretty confusing behavior where even if you release some scene graph objects, the memory use still stays high, and that's because internal to the system, it has sort of a lazy cache where it keeps those objects alive in memory until there's great memory pressure, and then it reclaims them. But it does make it very tricky. But I think this only happens in a particular allocation pattern of scene graph objects. It's kind of an artificial test case. I don't think it's so much of a problem in real world channels, but we should get that feedback from people if they are being, very challenged by that.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Why graphic memory typically just spikes up and stays like that most of the time? Is this normal?
That is normal. It's kind of like what we were talking about a minute ago, where channels will get evicted from system memory. So the texture, we call it texture memory. The graphics memory will not throw anything out until it needs to. So it will fill up completely, and then the next texture you allocate will cause something to get thrown away. So yes, that's normal.
Okay. And from the same submitter, why does channel only allow to use 328 megabytes of RAM while the device has 1 gigabyte? It seems too small.
I don't know all the details of how those decisions get made. I know that it's different for each device. The device I was using for that demo was a Gilbert, which is a fairly low powered device. I don't know, Kevin, do you know what goes into that number?
Yeah, I mean it's complicated, but um, Roku OS is based on a Linux system. That 1 gigabyte, only a fraction of that is actually available to the OS itself. Some of it's reserved for other purposes. And then within the OS, there's a lot going on behind the scenes that's going to use, the bulk of the memory. So
Yeah, and that
You also,
correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but that does not include texture memory. That 328 is just the channel objects.
I believe that's right. Ron,
Yeah,
I think
so
you prefer.
328 is actually quite a bit in my mind. Like unless you have some enormous channel with tons of content, I wouldn't expect you would get anywhere close to it most of the time.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I think that
And
doesn't include video. I'm sorry, just finishing off that thought. I don't think that includes the texture memory or video memory. Um,
Right.
okay, so we've got one question left right now. So if there's anybody who wants to try to sneak in a few more, we've still got a little bit of our allotted time slot left. So this question is, in addition to Vital's question regarding allowed RAM, Roku Docs says, foreground limit may be decreased in the near future. Therefore, channels should consume only 75% of the displayed limit. Is that true?
I would say yes, just out of an abundance of caution. I'm not sure why that's in the docs, but yes, if it says it, I would say you should probably follow it.
yeah, Justin, um, we did do analysis of, your report, and it is, we do consider it a problem. Uh, I'll have to defer to, not making any promises, but I think it is on our radar to see if we can make an improvements in the future.
Also, I'll just add why it's in the docs is just sort of to in case that there was in the near future any requirements put in on memory consumption that it would not cause a disruption to your app. So
Okay. All right. Thank you, Jonathan, for jumping in and clarifying that. And okay, from Justin. Hi, following up on my question about memory versus node allocation. Kevin is right. It is a bit contrived when we push it to crash, but we are running into the RRM graph behavior with our EPG.
Yeah, sorry, I jumped ahead, but that's what I was referring to when I just said, we do agree that it's an issue. We understand that, and it's on our radar. But as always, we can't make promises as to, um, when we can address that.
Okay. Next question might have been addressed before, but how do you get rendezvous to show up in RRM?
It should be fairly automatic. Be sure that that particular chart is enabled, but they should just show up on their own. There's nothing special to turn on that I can
yeah,
think of.
if your app has an rendezvous, it'll show up in the rendezvous graph. Um, it will show up if you don't have a rendezvous, that every time sample have a like a donut hole on the timeline. If you have a rendezvous, the circle will be fully filled in, and you can click on the circle to see exactly where the rendezvous was. If you aren't seeing rendezvous, maybe your app currently is not triggering any of them.
Okay. Okay, so next question. Does stream playbacks in video nodes fill up any memory available for developers? Ooh, that one disappeared a little fast.
Yeah, I think we kind of covered that. The answer to that one is no, it doesn't. That's a separate pool of memory.
Okay, awesome. And thank you for these tools. I've been a Roku dev for 10 years, and I can say for sure you are changing lives.
Oh,
Thank you, Liam.
appreciate that.
Appreciate that, Liam. Ah,
Okay.
let me take that one. What does
Okay.
the triangle with the exclamation mark
Oh.
icon indicate in the rendezvous graph? Pay attention to that, because we store a maximum of 1,000 rendezvous in a buffer. And if you get to 1001 before your next polling cycle from RRM, we'll drop the oldest rendezvous. That means you're beginning to lose rendezvous data. That also means that you're generating a ton of rendezvous. Basically, your render thread and your task threads is sitting there in synchronization all the time. That's something I would double click into and say why you need to generate that many rendezvous, and see if there's some design practices that you can leverage that reduce the number of rendezvous you are generating. And with that, I'm going to plug Chris Hagedorn's next webinar, where he will talk about design practices to take down rendezvous. So if you see that exclamation mark, that is not a good thing. So that means you're generating too many rendezvous. That's something I double click on immediately on the source code and figure out how to reduce the number of rendezvous you're triggering.
Okay, awesome. All right, and so we still got a little bit of time if anybody wants to use the URL or the QR code on the screen. Sneak in a couple more questions, but if that's it, then we'll wrap it up. So let's see if Jonathan has any more for us that we can run through.
So there are no other questions. Oh, well, hold on, I'll just throw that one in there. Maybe this is a good way to wrap up on a high note.
Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate this. We
You are
appreciate
very welcome.
y'all joining us on this Monday, spending time with us and participating and asking questions. And yep, our next webinar, as Ram just mentioned, is going to be on best practices. So make sure that if you found this useful, that you can join that one. And I think I saw somebody raise their hand.
Also, when we do the hand raising, I'll do the typical spiel on if you guys want to, shortly after this is done, we will get the replays up on YouTube, the Roku video portal, and our Roku developers channel. So you can expect to see the replays being available tomorrow-ish, in case you want to share it with your coworkers. Yeah, it'll be there for you.
So the question that we have, where can I see all webinars scheduled? I don't think we have a public calendar, but we can definitely talk about maybe doing something in the future if we want to start planning stuff farther out.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, ideally, if we get to a point where we've got multiple webinars lined up, we definitely will put a calendar together. But in the interim, your best tool to find out what's coming up is just pay attention to the Roku developers blog. We usually post the webinar announcements 1 or 2 weeks before we broadcast the webinars, and also the Roku developer Slack will post that in there as well. So, and also we do. So in the note that says maybe email subscriptions, potentially that's a good idea. And then also, like, this past webinar was announced in the Roku developers newsletter as well. So there's all kinds of vehicles in which we do it, but we definitely can do better, particularly if we get more lined up ahead of time.
Okay. Anything else? Any last minute questions?
That's it. We've got nothing else in the Slido.
All right. Well, once again, thank you so much for joining us, for submitting your questions. Yes, you will look and you will find communications from us in the future about upcoming webinars. And have a happy Monday and have a great week, everybody.